Our water is being threatened every day by both natural and human-caused events such as wildfires and urban population growth. Water is an essential resource for life. Welcome to the Transformation Network. The Transformation Network is all about using diverse sources of knowledge in order to develop creative solutions for the future.
Hi, I'm Jaimie Ritchie, and I'm a curious college student. I'm studying civil engineering at the University of New Mexico. I'm from Taos, and I was home for the summer when the smoke from the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon fire started drifting over. I remember being curious about this wildfire that was making national news. How did it actually start? I heard multiple rumors saying different things. I was curious, and I wanted to know more. Who is it that was evacuated? Were they okay? Would the forest ever return and be the same, even if it's beyond my lifetime?
This morning, unprecedented high winds and bone-dry conditions threatening to explode an already monster-sized fire in New Mexico. The Calf Canyon Hermit Peaks fire combining weeks ago, now burning an area bigger than Chicago.
The Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire is the largest fire in New Mexico recorded history. It burned over 340,000 acres, which is bigger than the city of Los Angeles and over 13 and a half times the size of Disney World. It was devastating to many people who lived in Las Vegas and in the area surrounding it. Over 15,500 homes were evacuated. I remember hearing about the uncertainty surrounding the fire and who was to blame. I talked to Tomasz Fulowski, an assistant professor of forestry at Highlands University in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He told me more about the factors that contributed to this fire, including years of forest mismanagement, a postponed controlled burn, and high winds. I'd like to share with you some of what he told me.
I mean, this was kind of a perfect storm with this fire. So many factors came together that led to it being as destructive as it was. So the first thing is pretty much a century's worth of mismanagement of forests, right? So there was the policy of the Forest Service historically. I'm not 100% sure when this stopped being their policy, but for a good part of the 20th century, it was that they wanted to put out a fire within 24 hours of it being detected. Fire is a natural component in these ecosystems in southwestern forests. And so the removal of fire allowed for really dense forest stands with a lot of trees, and that in turn act as a lot of fuel to develop. And recently we've been trying to address this through thinning, and certainly thinning is a really important component of forest management, and doing more of that is going to be really important. And then we get into the very delicate question of prescribed fire, because once you do the thinning, then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, I've got all of this slash. What am I going to do with it? Because if I just leave it on site, that's still fuel. And so at least making sure that that slash is being treated in a safe way. There's lots of we can do chipping, we can do mastication. Prescribed fire is a tool in our toolbox, but making sure that it's being used judiciously. And this ties into the other issue that made this fire as destructive as it was, which is climate change, right? We see an increase in the intensity of these fires for a number of reasons associated with climate change. So first off, we were in a record period of drought. We were in a period where we had I want to say I read somewhere that this was like the most red flag warnings on record was for that month, and so that basically we are moving into a new system in which the way that we have done things historically may need to change, right? So what used to be acceptable conditions for prescribed fire, well, we need to think about whether that is reflective of the climate future or the climate reality in which we're living. Tied in with that, we can talk about pine bark beetle infestations, and how that has created huge stands of dead trees, and that also allows for wildfire to spread much more aggressively too. So it's going to be an uphill battle, right? The amount of funding that, for instance, the Forest Service has to actually proactively manage our forests is pretty limited, especially given how much of their resources they put into fighting wildfire. And of course, we want to protect homes, we want to protect communities, and so really, I think it's going to be. I don't envy the task that is laid out in front of them to manage for healthy and resilient forests in the time period of climate change, when so much of their efforts and their resources and their time are going into literally putting out the fires that needs to be dealt with immediately.
While the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon fires started individually, they soon combined and conquered. So much of New Mexico was consumed in this raging wildfire. I remember not being able to hike last summer because of the extra high risk due to the raging fire and the drought conditions. Despite the widespread impacts of the wildfire, no fatalities were reported. However, many people had to evacuate, and some lost their homes. Luckily, the firefighters were able to make a significant difference. Many homes were protected as a priority as the wildfire raged through residential areas. I talked to Steve Smabby, a ranch owner near Mora. He was evacuated along with his alpacas during the fire. He has a lovely lake on his property that the firefighters were able to use to help save both his property and those of his neighbors.
So I was saying that the fire was on the other side of the Rio La Casa, the little Rio La Casa, the little river there. It came all the way from the Dukes in one day up to there, about 12 miles south of here. It was windy, and it got there, it climbed up, it was coming up the mountain on this side. It actually started heading, the wind started going toward the east, and it was starting to come down. The wind died down that night. Firefighters got in here, and they set up a control line all along the base here, and they started back burning. So they burned it from the bottom. Areas that we had thinned, it just kind of got the grass a little bit. Further up where it wasn't so thinned, some of the areas got burned pretty bad. But they kept the fire going up the hill. The next morning when it started, wind picked up again, all that fuel was gone, and the fire couldn't come downhill. So that basically saved us. And if it weren't for that, if that wind had kept on coming and they weren't able to back burn it, it would have come down the mountain, and it wasn't going to stop when I got here. They saved my butt. So they were also taking water out of the lake. They looked around and said, "Hey, this is pretty easy to protect. It's already fairly thinned out. If we start a fire, it's not going to go this way that much."
Many homes were saved, but burning was far from the only effect that these fires had on the community. The monsoon rains came early and intensely.
We are having one of the best monsoon seasons that we've ever had, but we can't capture any of the water because of the fire.
The rains stopped the fire from burning anymore, but they did not come without their own set of difficulties. Tomasz Falowski will tell us more about how fires change the soil. It becomes harder for water to absorb, and the lack of living trees leaves the soil looser, which causes more ash and debris to flow downstream.
As far as fire's effect on soils, it's pretty limited in terms of the depth to which the impacts are really felt. Usually the top 5-ish centimeters of soil are really the ones that are going to be most affected. Below that, the heat from the fire, even in fairly intense burns, is not going to permeate that far down. So the soil effects are largely more on the surface, and then certainly in terms of the erosion that happens after the fire. But the permeability or the infiltration, the issues there, really associated with the fire producing a lot of ash and char, a lot of which is fairly hydrophobic. And so as that starts working its way into the soil, sometimes we can get the development of this hydrophobic layer that prevents water from entering and permeating down through the soil profile, or basically down vertically through the soil. And so that can increase, is one of the things that can increase stormwater runoff in burn scars after fire events.
I was curious to know what effects this contamination of the Guyanus River had on the city of Las Vegas.
This restoration work in Guyanus Canyon is top priority because it's the drinking water for Las Vegas, New Mexico.
We are looking at only about a few weeks of water supply left. We've imposed higher stages of conservation within the city.
To learn more, I talked to Maria Gilvery, the water utility director for Las Vegas, New Mexico. She told me about how the ash, debris, and flooding had contaminated 2 of the 3 reservoirs that Las Vegas uses for its drinking water.
After the fire, there was a tremendous amount of ash and debris that came down the river, came down from our watershed. It was caught up at the diversion where the city diverts its water off the river for treatment. And much of that ash was also getting into at least one of our storage reservoirs, or 2 of them actually. One was, we really couldn't control it. It's a shared reservoir in that story, and it has multiple access points to that reservoir. It was going to be impacted, and there was very little we could do to keep all of the ash out. The other reservoir, Peterson, is a reservoir that we do control. It's off-river reservoir, so we control what goes into it and out of it, with the exception of there was a tremendous rainstorm and some water came down from an adjacent property and ended up blocking some of our culverts and overtopped what's called a bypass. It goes around the reservoir. It ended up backing up into that bypass, filling up to the point where it overtopped and ended up contaminating Peterson Reservoir. So we did have to take Peterson Reservoir offline. It did actually result in the system automatically shutting down. That was the reservoir we were using primarily. And the water treatment plant's automated system recognized that the turbidity was spiking and shut the system down. And it wasn't until the next morning that we went out there and found out why it had automatically shut down. So we've pretty much stayed off of Peterson since. We've switched to Bradner Reservoir as our primary reservoir. We're working on methods and means to clean the sediment out of Peterson. So that's a little bit of a challenge. We want to be able to at least use some of that water. We don't want to be in the same position this coming year with having limited options. We are expecting possibly this year to be worse than last year. More sediment coming down the river, possibly more rains, maybe even a stronger monsoon. And so we're trying to make sure that our reservoirs are topped off, and we do everything we can to protect the reservoirs from being impacted.
The contamination of their reservoirs left Las Vegas high and dry. Water use restrictions were in place, and the government sent out boxed water to be used for drinking. Steve Smabby told me how lucky he felt that only half of his ranch burned, 150 acres, and that all the structures were intact. Most of the people I interviewed were in the academic field. Many of them were very forgiving, attributing the cause of the fire to the extra high winds and drought conditions. I know there are people out there whose homes burned and who blame the Forest Service for the controlled burn that ran out of control in April of 2022. Regardless of who is to blame, the forest is returning.
What we're looking at is fetid goosefoot. This plant right here, as you can see, it has a very, very small root mass. This plant comes in after disturbances. In our case, we're talking about a fire disturbed area. Like as you can see around you, we've got a lot of burned trees, lack of fuels on the ground. But this stuff comes in after disturbance, and it's native. As you can tell, it's kind of a tumbleweedy, if that's a word. And it disperses its seeds, as a tumbleweed would. That's why its roots are so shallow. Like it's meant to just break off and dissipate. But this is one of the first things that came back after our fire in particular. We also had a high rate of scrub oak come in. The scrub oak pops up after disturbances from the roots of the previous scrub oak, like trees. And it just propagates everywhere. Like as you can see behind me, just around me, we've got little stands coming in. They're gonna be some of the first succession trees that come through. Hopefully hold our soils to prevent erosion. That is our main goal at the moment, is to prevent erosion and to aid in the reabsorption of water so it stays in our environments, so we can get more plant development. Like if we have more water, we're obviously going to have more plants, and that also works the inverse. If we have more plants, we're going to have more water in the system. The soil quality is kind of rough anyways.
But really this is just vegetation to hold soil. We just want roots in the soil because that'll help prevent water from carrying the soil away.
The fire may have stopped burning, but it's not over. The effects of the fire will last a long time. Homes have burned to the ground. The people of Las Vegas need a new water treatment system that can deal with the ash that is flowing down off of the mountain. The area smells like barbecue and is black and burned. But it will recover. It may take years, decades, even lifetimes. The Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon fire burned especially hot, making it harder for the forests to recover. But restoration efforts are being done. The people of Las Vegas are caring for their land through replanting. Steve is thinning areas of his ranch so that they are less of a fire hazard in the future. Baby trees are being planted and looked after so that our forest will return quickly and healthily. This isn't the end, simply a new beginning.